Hey, hi, hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about my 2021 reading stats. So we're going to go over all the books I read briefly in 2021. We're going to talk about all the different statistics that come along with all the things that I track throughout the year. And if you have seen my first half of the year tracking, it's going to be very similar to that, but I won't be going over favorites because I do already have a favorites video out for the year. So if you want to watch that, go and watch that video. It also is like storming outside, so if you hear that, it's not me, it's the weather. So first up, I will have a rolling thing going right here of all 165 books that I read this year. So I did read 165 books. I enjoyed most of them, I will say. So my main goal going into 2021 is I wanted to read less than 2020. And I did accomplish that. In 2020, I read 200 books. And this year I read 165, like I said. So definitely less. My main focus with that goal was to have other hobbies and enjoy other things. I feel like I'm still struggling to find that balance between working a full-time job, doing booktube videos twice a week, reading for my reading goals and reading because I genuinely enjoy it, spending time with family, and then also, you know, catching up on YouTube, catching up on TV shows, the limited TV shows that I watch. It's hard to have any other hobbies. I do paint and I do journal sometimes, but even that is like maybe once a week, maybe a few times a month. It is kind of a back burner thing that I do. Moving into this year, I'm not so focused on that being one of my future goals. You can go watch my 2022 goals video if you would like, and you can see what my goals are, but it is something that I do consistently want to have is other hobbies going on. Even if I only do them once a month or a couple of times a year, I like to have those hobbies. I like to have something else that I'm doing. So I would say though that 165 books from 200 was a success on that goal. I also wanted to be focusing on enjoying my books more and not so much being caught up in just finishing books from the beginning, trying to find books that I knew I was going to like more. So my rating at the end of the year, my average rating is a 3.85. When I go on Goodreads, because Notion can break things down into 0.25s, however I want to break down my rating. So I do have it broken down into like 3.5s or 4.25s, whatever I want. But Goodreads doesn't have that ability. So when I look at my Goodreads rating for the year, it is at a 3.9. So it rounded up a little bit. This is higher than my average rating, which is still at a 3.5 on Goodreads. I don't know if it's ever gonna go up. It's been there for a really long time. A 3.8 or a 3.9, whichever you want to go with, is higher than a 3.5. So I did genuinely enjoy the books I read this year more than books I have read in the past. And I actually, when I look back on this year, I'm genuinely happy with this list. And when I look at all 165 books versus the 200 I read the year before, I genuinely enjoyed these books more. So here are the statistics of how many books I read every single month. So in January, I read 19 books. In February, I read 17. In March, I read 16. In April, I read 10. In May and in June, I both read 16. In July, I read 9. And in August, I read 7. I don't totally know what happened. I know that in July, I was struggling a lot with a slump, but apparently according to this chart, it moved into August as well. In September, I read 14 books. In October, I read 15 books. In November, I read 10, and I know exactly what happened that month. While 10 is not a bad number, I came back from a work trip and I went into a depressive funk for a few weeks, and so I just did not read basically the first 2 weeks of November. And then finally in December, I read 16 books and I made my goal of 165, which I wanted to hit somewhere around 150. And I think 165 is close enough to 150. When you break down my ratings, I don't exactly know how to talk about this chart because it divides it up super weird. So you can see though that most of my ratings are a 3-star or higher. So actually looking at this chart, majority of books that I rate them a 5-star. I will talk a little bit about that when I get into how many books I reread this year, but overall, clearly I enjoyed the books I like. You can see I don't have a bell curve where the middle is more so ratings like a lot of people. I definitely have a line curve, I don't know what to call it, where I have way less 1-star books and way more 5-star books and 4-star books. I mean, if you look at this, I had close to 55-star books this year, and some of that I know is because I have read so much in my lifetime that I know what I like, and I can pretty easily tell from before even starting a book if I'm gonna like it or not. But also some of this is definitely because I choose to DNF, and sometimes I choose to DNF books that I know are gonna be 3 stars, and if I had stuck with those books, then my bell curve might have been a thing. And then you can also see here that my genres are broken up into lots of different things. I decided to stop tracking subgenres after my first 6 months because this is just a lot easier to look at. So I judge a book's genre based on the topmost genre that it is. So if a book crosses between, for instance, some of Neil Gaiman's books could be considered fantasy or horror, I tend to look at whichever one is on top, and then I tend to also think about which one I felt like the book was most, because really all that matters when it comes to my own tracking is my own opinion. So as you can see, fantasy is the highest. I knew this was going to be a thing. It's at 52%. I'm very, very happy with that. Sci-fi is my next highest. I was making an effort, especially in the second half of the year, to read a lot more sci-fi, but you can see up above that I do have a category for dystopian, and I think if I put those two together, I mean, of course it would be higher because I'm putting 2 categories together, but I do track them separately just because I personally like to have them separate. Magical realism is next, and then horror, which makes sense to me. I probably would have bet that they would have been opposite of each other, but they are so close that it really doesn't seem like that big of a difference. Romance is next. So that's books that either the romance is a fantasy romance and I felt like the romance was more important to the story than the fantasy element, or it was just a straight up romance that I read. Historical fiction, mystery, and thriller. So mystery and thriller is technically one category. Again, I keep them separate. So once again, if I feel like my focus of the story is more about the mystery of the story, then I'm gonna call it a mystery. If I feel like the focus of the story is more about the thrilling and the suspense, then I'm gonna call it a thriller. Technically, yes, they are the same thing, but like fantasy and sci-fi, or sci-fi and dystopian, a lot of people put those books together and I don't. I also have a category for humor. I think most of the books that fall into that are I did reread some of Series of Unfortunate Events this year, and so that's kind of where I decided to categorize them instead of as fantasy, because they're not really fantasy and they're not really fiction, and I wasn't totally sure what to call them, so I put them there. There are 3 categories that you can't see right there. They don't have names. So those 3 categories are contemporary, fiction, and autobiography. Next up is the age demographic for the book. So I decided this year to also start counting new adult and adult separate. As you can see, my biggest red age demographic is young adult. But actually what's really interesting, if you go back to my 6 months, young adult was at 50% of what I had read, and everything else was broken up into the other 50%. Here you can see that adult is only 2% lower, and I think that in 2022, I'm already predicting that my adult section is going to be way closer to 50%, and my young adult section is going to be much smaller, because I am finding myself drawn to more adult stories and I'm not drawn to young adult as much. I am still reading it, but it is definitely something that is much lesser, and I am more likely to DNF young adult books. New adult is at 16.4%. That's mostly my fantasy romances that I have been getting into recently. And middle grade is at 7.3%, which is mostly Series of Unfortunate Events that I read this year. Normally that section is a little bit smaller, but since I didn't read all 13 of them. My library unhaul, and so when I was like on book like 9 or 10, they got rid of all of them, so I couldn't finish the reread, but it was fine because they were a reread for me. Okay, let's talk about some of the other numbers that I keep tracked in my Notion tracker. One day I will show this to you all. So out of all the books that I read 41 of them were physical books, 124 of them were audiobooks, and 15 of them were ebooks. Those numbers do not equal 165. That is because some books I listen to and read along with, and so I count both of them as a check mark for that. That totaled 19,975 pages read between the electronic and the ebooks, and 2,357 hours. That is not actually correct. Let me get you the number. I put in the whole audiobook. I don't put it in as the speed that I listen to it as. So my actual approximate number of hours that I listened to audiobooks this year was 1,178. 95 of them were owned books, and 77 of them were library books. Again, the numbers will not equal 165 because I count both if I have done both. Also, 14 of them were ARCs. I no longer count my ARCs towards my owned counter. So I used to do that and they would be marked off as both owned and ARCs. I don't do that anymore. They are just ARCs. 28 of them were rereads, and most of those rereads were 5 stars. I reread a bunch of Brandon Sanderson this year. I reread Lemony Snicket. I reread a few other things too. I think that's part of why my 5 stars are so high, is because I knew beforehand going into these books that I was going to reread books that I already loved. Although I will say that a lot of the books I reread got different ratings than the first time, and that's something I'm very used to and I'm very comfortable with. No books were read twice in this year. That was something I did a bunch in 2020. I reread more than 5 books, and I thought I was going to do it this year, especially with The Queen of the Tearling, but I found that I just did not have time to do that. 109 of the books I read were part of a series. I do not track if they were the beginning, the middle, or the end of a series because I genuinely don't care if I'm finishing series or not. I will get to them when I get to them, and if I never get to them, it doesn't bother me. It clearly means that it's something I'm not wanting to finish. 12 of the books I started and then put down, and then later in the year decided to pick up again and ended up finishing. So I call those retry books. So I don't always count them as DNFs. Sometimes I put books on pause and then come back and retry them. Sometimes I DNF them and then come back and retry them. Sometimes I read a few chapters and don't even count it as anything, and then a few months later come back and start it up again. 10 of the books were for book club. That makes sense. We take 2 months off for the year to do month-long readathons. So that is June and December. We no longer read multiple books in a month, although that's funny because this month actually we are reading 2 books, so my numbers will be a little bit different for next year. And then 49 of my books were buddy reads of some kind with either family, friends, people in my book club, but it wasn't specifically for book club. And then 38 of the books I read this year were specifically for a video that I was filming, meaning that they were not part of a reading vlog, a weekly reading vlog, but they were part of a video. I was reading them specifically for that video prompt. Out of my 21 books to read in 2021, I read 18 of them. I basically decided at the end of the year there were 3 left. 2 of them I own and were sequels, and I had decided that I wasn't in the right mindset to continue on with them. One of them was mostly because I need to go back and reread the first one, that is Broken Web. The other one is because I wasn't in the mood for something so dark and heavy, that is The Empire's Ruin by Brian Staveley. The other book that I never ended up reading was Empire of the Wild. I have it at my library, but I basically lost interest in this book. I decided that that was fine because I was already looking at my statistics, which I'm about to talk to you about, for what I rated the average amount of these books, and I wasn't happy with that number. When I looked at these numbers, I did decide going into 2022 that I was no longer going to pick books that I thought I was going to rate 5 stars. That's just unrealistic because I seem to do a really bad job at predicting 5-star reads. I can usually predict if I'm going to like a book or not, but I can't seem to predict if I'm going to rate it a 5-star or not. So going into 2022, I decided to do it a little bit differently, where I just had 22 books I wanted to read before the end of the year, or I would be really upset with myself. Whereas this year I did genuinely try to pick books I thought I was going to rate highly. So if I count the DNFs, because there were quite a few DNFs, as zeros, my average rating is a 2.6. If I count the DNFs for what I predict I would have rated the book by the end of it, my average rating would be a 3.2, which is still much lower than my average rating for my entire life, and way, way, way lower than my average rating for this year. Out of all the books I read, I did DNF 49 books. I started counting books that I had only read a chapter or two of as sampling at some point in this year. So some of these books I would no longer count as DNFs, but I did not bother to go back and change the statistics of this. So I did finish 165 books, but then also there were 49 books that I started and read some amount of. You can go watch my DNFs video if you'd like to know all of those details. The longest book that I read was Oathbringer at 1,248 pages, which was a reread for me. And then the shortest book was The Sleeper and the Spindle at 72 pages. So I apparently have a vast array of page amounts that I will read. My average book length in 2021 is 436 pages. These numbers I get from Goodreads, so I don't actually know. Actually, wait, I can break that up for you in Notion. Hold up a second. I just realized I can tell you my averages. My average physical book read number is 363 pages, and my average audiobook length is 19 hours. The most popular book that I read this year was The Midnight Library, with close to 2 million other people have shelved this book. My least popular was Raven Awakening, with 162 people having shelved the book. That's really interesting because I think I rated both of those a 3-star. My first review for the year was for the book Cia Martinez and the Moonlit Beginning of Everything, and my review consisted of 8 words, which say directly, yeah, this is a new instant favorite! Exclamation point. I stopped tracking all of the books that I had bought this year. That was something I was doing so that at the end of the year I could tell you, oh, I bought this many books and I read this many of them. I only have 3 books that I have not read or finished from 2020. I only have 14 books from 2021 that I have not read or finished, which I feel like is fantastic. I have bought quite a bunch. Technically, I bought them in November and December, but I am not counting them as being bought in 2021 because I bought them for 2022. So I'm counting them as being bought in 2022. So I ended the year at having 17 books on my owned not read TBR. I came into the year with about 45. I was doing it on purpose. I wanted to have that. I wanted to do it. It's for a reason, so I see no problem with it. That is all of the statistics for the books that I read in 2021. I think that this was a pretty good reading year. I'm not mad about any of the statistics that I have here. I'm actually genuinely very happy about how these things turned out. Let me know down below how many books you read this year and what your reading year looked like. I'm super excited to be able to say this is my first time I've done this on my channel because last year I forgot to film a reading stats video for 2020. I had fun. I hope you did too. I don't remember how my outro goes, but until next time, I'll talk to you in the comments. Bye.